Welcome to Exercise Physiology and a discussion of Chapter 2 of our text, Control of the Internal Environment. We're going to talk about the various ways that your body can maintain constant internal conditions. And you've probably learned about that before, but we would like to add maybe a little bit to what you learned in the past by talking about the specific challenges and changes and some terms associated with those with respect to exercise. Things happen during exercise that make all the difference in the way we see homeostasis. So homeostasis is the maintenance of a constant internal environment despite changes in the outside of the body. We're going to use the term normal, and I'll say more about that in a second. The conditions we're talking about, each individual condition, is called a variable. It can change, such as the heart rate, body temperature, the arterial blood pressure. Those are things that are very carefully regulated by some control systems in your body. There's an example of arterial blood pressure, and it varies within a range, what we call the normal range. So the average pressure is right around 93 millimeters of mercury. That's the units we use for pressure, and we'll learn about those another time. There's systems in place to maintain that range of blood pressure. So the normal range, when we say that, now that we're talking about exercise physiology, the normal range is going to refer to resting conditions in the body. Because during exercise, we're going to move some variables away from this range. And if we exercise at a constant rate, then we're going to reach a new constant value for the variable. That's what we call steady state. During the transition from rest to that new exercise rate, the variable will be changing, but eventually, through homeostatic regulation, it will reach a new steady state value. So if you're exercising at a constant rate, right, a constant work rate or power, as we talked about in Chapter 1, the heart rate will reach also a constant rate. It'll be elevated over rest, but it'll be constant, steady state. Likewise, the core temperature of your body, as you transition from rest to a particular exercise rate, will rise, and then we'll reach a steady state as long as we are exercising at a constant rate and it's not too hot. We're not exercising the most furiously we can, then we'll reach a new steady state, a higher body temperature than the resting or normal body temperature. And here's a little graph illustrating this principle. Body temperature at rest, we say, its textbook value is 37 degrees Celsius. If we institute an exercise bout and we stay at a constant exercise rate, the temperature will rise and then be maintained at that new rate. More heat is being produced by the muscles. That heat must be dissipated, and the mechanisms to invoke that dissipation of heat occur as this variable rises. So we'll talk more about that. You know, homeostasis occurs within cells. They have a lot of processes that are regulated. Their production of various proteins, and they recycle their proteins. So they have to break down old ones, synthesize new ones. Cells produce energy. The resting muscle cells maintain a certain amount of ATP and creatine phosphate, and it stays constant. That's the normal resting value, and then when we exercise, it'll change, and the cell will do something about that. There'll be a system in place to start replacing that energy, that ATP, right away. Stored nutrients, glycogen, for example, and we'll talk more about that later. Organ systems are the ones that control things like we were talking about, the arterial blood pressure. You need to replenish oxygen. It's being extracted from the blood by the muscles, and so the oxygen content will go down, and that'll trigger some responses. Actually, CO2 will be produced by the muscle cells, and that'll begin to rise, and that is a change in a variable that will trigger ventilation, for example, breathing deeper. So, biological control systems that actually are in place to maintain those homeostatic conditions, or those steady state conditions during exercise, have some sort of standard components. In order to maintain a variable in a particular range, you have to have a receptor that can detect that variable. The body has to have a way of measuring it. So whenever we talk about a particular variable or condition in the body, you should always be asking yourself, do I know what is the receptor for that? What in the body can determine arterial blood pressure? What in your body can determine blood glucose levels, and so forth, and CO2 levels, carbon dioxide in the body fluids and in the blood? Then there has to be a control center. That information will be sent to a control center to take in the inputs and assess the problem. Integration is the word we often use to talk about that process, integrating some inputs and then making a decision and then sending information out to some organs or body systems that can change the variable, return it towards normal. Those are called effectors. So here's an example of a negative feedback system. This horizontal bar represents resting normal values of some variable, and if the thing tips like this, what we're saying is we have a change in that variable, and that change in the variable is called the stimulus. That's what triggers a negative feedback response, a homeostatic control system response. So we got the stimulus, and there has to be a sensor for it, a receptor. That's the word we used in the previous slide. So a receptor detects the change, it detects the stimulus, the change in the variable, and sends information to the control center. The control center in turn integrates or assesses the situation and sends information out to some effector that can, effector is something that actually has a grip on the variable and can change it back towards normal. Not too normal, I would stress. The thing that changed the variable that caused the stimulus, if it's still present, then the variable will not return to normal, it will return toward normal. Hence the idea of a steady state during exercise. As you increase the body temperature, the homeostatic mechanisms do not return the body temperature to normal while you're still exercising. They return it toward normal, but they maintain a new steady state, just to distinguish those things. At rest, yes, it will get very close to the normal range. Okay. Some examples of negative feedback systems. Control of carbon dioxide in the blood, we said just a minute ago. Right? If we have sensors in the brainstem that can sense kind of indirectly the CO2 pressure in your body fluids, in your blood, and therefore in the fluid around the brainstem cells. There's the hypothalamus, is actually the control center. And the hypothalamus has control of what's called the respiratory control centers in your brainstem, the medulla and pons, and they will activate muscles of ventilation, breathing. Those are the effectors that will increase the rate at which CO2 is being blown off. That's a term we often use, or dissipated from the body, and CO2 concentration will go back towards normal. Regulation of body temperature. There are temperature-sensitive neurons that recognize the stimulus, the change in body temperature, either rising or diminishing. Those are different sets of neurons that report to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus receives information from the deep, from sensors in the deep organs of the body as well as on the body's surface, integrates all that information, and then controls in turn the blood vessels in the skin. It can dilate those vessels if the body temperature is rising, and it can activate sweat glands, so we have increasing evaporative heat loss. Pretty familiar stuff, I imagine. Regulation of blood glucose. There has to be a receptor. So when you eat a meal, and you digest and absorb all the glucose from that meal, from the carbohydrates, blood glucose goes up. That's a stimulus, a change in blood glucose concentration. And the pancreas will in turn release insulin, and insulin will cause the cells in your body to take up the glucose, and it will start to return back towards normal. And eventually, when the glucose from the meal is swept away, it will maintain glucose concentration in the normal range, the resting range. Here's a little bit of a more schematic diagram of the example of temperature regulation. If the body temperature starts to rise, that's a stimulus, change in body temperature, activates some sensory neurons which recognize changes in temperature, the sensors, the receptors, send information to the hypothalamus. It's worth writing that right in there if you're working on your computer. Hypothalamus activates effectors in response to the changes in temperature. It integrates, then it sends information. Vasodilation, that's what we mean by blood vessels dilating. The term is vasodilation. Bring hot blood to the surface of the body and the skin so that we can dissipate more heat from the surface, and also activate the sweat glands. We have evaporation of water, which takes energy out of the body. So now we have the body temperature returning towards normal. If we're just at rest, yes, the body temperature will then be kept in the normal range by this procedure. But if we're exercising, it will return towards the normal range and fall into a new steady state range. All right, how about if the body temperature falls? You step outside on a cold day and the heat starts to increase. You start losing more heat from your body at a higher rate. The body temperature goes down as the stimulus. The sensory neurons of various positions on your body servicing in the core of your body will sense the drop in body temperature. The hypothalamus will get the news, send information to effectors, will vasoconstrict, bring the hot blood away from the surface of the body so that we're not losing heat from that blood quite as quickly, turn off the sweat glands, and return the body temperature towards normal. It will also invoke some more complex behavioral changes, right? We'll find our jacket and put it on, or maybe get out of the wind. We'll possibly go right back inside. So that's an example of a negative feedback system. We have a stimulus, which is a change in a variable. We're going to reduce that change. So negative feedback is we're going to reduce that change, bringing the variable back towards normal. I hesitate to even put this slide up here because the impression is that there are negative feedback systems and positive feedback systems constantly at work in our bodies, controlling various variables. Positive feedback is invoked only in very limited number of situations. So it's a rare kind of a thing, but it exists, so we love to talk about it. So during childbirth, contraction of the uterus is initiated by the cervix being deformed as the first contractions occur. That head of that baby deforms, starts to stretch the cervix, this muscular sphincter, and the sensory neurons in the cervix send information to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, in turn, releases oxytocin by way of the pituitary gland. It's actually neurons in the hypothalamus doing it. Oxytocin goes into the blood and invokes uterine contraction, which stretches the cervix more, which activates the sensory neurons more. Hypothalamus releases more oxytocin and more oxytocin and more oxytocin and more contraction and more stretching the cervix. You get the idea. Eventually the baby will be born. That's a positive feedback system. The concentration of oxytocin is rising throughout the entire process, as well as the muscle contractions in the uterus. Okay, so let's not even go there anymore. Positive feedback, set that aside. Think of negative feedback control systems that regulate the various variables in your body that we are familiar with, that we just discussed. The gain of a control system. Not all control systems have equal leverage to move variables from their normal position or back towards their normal range, and so we call that gain. The pulmonary and the lungs, the cardiovascular system, they have very large gains that can make huge changes in the variables that they impact, such as arterial blood pressure. So there are some other control systems that only make minute changes in their variables. So that's what's meant by a gain. And sometimes there's a change in gain. The system becomes more sensitized by exposure to some challenge. So the next time we get together, we'll go on and talk about the way your body changes whole homeostatic systems and mechanisms in response to environmental challenges.